Damian Cross leaned back in his chair and laughed, actually laughed, while his lawyer slid the divorce papers across the mahogany table toward Evelyn. Not a polite laugh, not the kind a man offers when he's trying to seem relaxed. It was the laugh of someone who believed, with every fiber of his being, that he had already won. He picked up the pen, clicked it once, and said to no one in particular, "Easiest thing I've done in years." Celeste Monroe, sitting just outside the conference room glass, caught his eye and smiled. Evelyn watched him sign his name and said nothing. She had learned, in the years since her father died, that silence was the only currency Damian had never learned to steal. If this story already has you gripped, stay with us until the very end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see just how far this story travels. The morning of the divorce hearing, Evelyn Whitmore woke at 4:30 in a hotel room she had been living in for 11 weeks. Not an apartment, not the penthouse on Michigan Avenue that still legally carried her name on the deed. A hotel room. A decent one, because her attorney, Margaret Osei, had insisted on at least that much, but a hotel room nonetheless. One rolling suitcase, a garment bag with her court clothes, a cardboard box of documents she had been building slowly and quietly for the better part of 8 months. She stood at the window and looked out at Lake Michigan in the dark. The water was flat and black and enormous, and she had the same thought she always had when she looked at it. Her father had loved that lake. Leonard Whitmore had grown up 3 blocks from its shore, and when he built Whitmore Global into one of the most powerful logistics companies in the Midwest, he had refused every offer to relocate to New York or Los Angeles. "Chicago is where I learned what water can do," he used to say. "It doesn't stop. It doesn't apologize. It just moves." She missed him in a way that had never gotten easier. 3 years since the heart attack. 3 years of trying to survive the aftermath. Not just grief, but the specific, suffocating disaster that her marriage had become once Leonard was no longer alive to see what was happening inside it. She poured coffee from the small in-room machine, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened the cardboard box. Evelyn had not always been the kind of woman who kept boxes of evidence. She had been, for most of her life, the kind of woman who trusted people, who assumed the best. Her father had called it her greatest strength and her greatest liability, sometimes in the same breath. You see people the way they could be, Evie, not always the way they are. That's a gift. Just don't let anyone use it against you. She had let someone use it against her. Damian Cross had come into her life at a fundraiser for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra 8 years ago, 6 years before her father died. He was 41 to her 34, handsome in a way that photographs captured better than real life, with the particular social fluency of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of being liked. He said the right things. He laughed at the right moments. He asked questions about her work instead of talking endlessly about his own. Leonard had met him twice before the engagement and offered his daughter a single, measured observation. "He's charming. Charming men are interesting to watch. Just make sure you're watching." She had thought she was. She hadn't been. The marriage had been, in the early years, something that resembled happiness. Damian was attentive without being suffocating, ambitious without being absent. He had his own financial consulting firm, Cross Capital, and he brought genuine expertise to the table when he began attending Whitmore Global board meetings at Leonard's invitation. He understood logistics. He understood capital structure. He understood, Evelyn came to realize much later, exactly what the company was worth and exactly how to position himself inside it. When Leonard died of a heart attack in his office on a Tuesday afternoon in March, Damian was the first person Evelyn called. He arrived at the hospital before her. He was already talking to Leonard's personal attorney, a man named Gerald Holt, when Evelyn walked through the door. She had registered it dimly, Damian and Gerald, heads together in a side corridor, and then her mother had appeared and taken her hand, and everything else had blurred. She thought about that corridor a lot, in the years that followed. The grief had been genuine, and it had been total. Evelyn had loved her father without condition, and losing him had hollowed her out in ways she was still, 3 years later, discovering. But grief had also made her dependent. Dependent on Damian in ways she had never been before Leonard died. And Damian had understood that dependency and used it with a precision that, looking back, made her feel physically ill. It had started with small things. "You don't have to be in that meeting, Evie. I'll handle it. You need rest." The board is going to want someone steady in the room. Let me take the lead this quarter. Holt says the trust restructuring is complicated. I've been working through it with him. You don't need to be involved in the technical details. Each sentence, taken alone, sounded like care. Strung together over 18 months, they were a systematic removal. Board meeting by board meeting, decision by decision, Damien had positioned himself as the operational authority at Whitmore Global, while Evelyn had receded into a version of herself she barely recognized. Uncertain, deferential, perpetually convinced she wasn't ready, wasn't sharp enough, wasn't her father's daughter in the ways that mattered. He had told her that too. Not cruelly, not directly, subtly. In the half-second pauses before he answered her questions, in the careful, patient tone he used when she raised objections at meetings, the same tone you might use with someone who didn't quite understand the material. I just want you to be protected, Evie. You've been through so much. She had believed him for longer than she wanted to admit. It was a woman named Pauline Dre who had changed things. Pauline had been Whitmore Global's Director of International Compliance for 11 years, hired personally by Leonard, intensely loyal to the company and deeply skeptical of Damien Cross in ways she had never felt safe enough to voice while he held operational control. When Evelyn had run into her at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park 14 months ago, an accident, or what had seemed like one, Pauline had sat across from her and said very quietly, "I need to ask you something personal, and I need you to not react yet. Can you do that?" Evelyn had said yes. "Do you know what's happening to the international shipping contracts? The ones your father built with the Singapore partners?" She hadn't known. She had been told they were being renegotiated. "They're being rerouted," Pauline said, "through a subsidiary called Meridian Freight Partners. Meridian is registered in the Cayman Islands. I spent 3 weeks trying to find the ownership structure." She paused. "Damien is the beneficial owner through 2 shell companies." Evelyn had sat very still and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "How long have you known this?" Pauline looked at her hands. 8 months. I didn't know how to tell you. I wasn't sure you'd believe me." That was the thing that had hurt the most, not the fraud. The fact that Pauline had been afraid she wouldn't believe her. The 8 months after that conversation had been the most difficult and most clarifying of Evelyn's life. She had hired Margaret Osei, a corporate litigation attorney with a reputation for surgical precision and absolute discretion. She had reached out, quietly and carefully, to Adrian Thorne, her father's former head of cybersecurity, who had been pushed out of Whitmore Global 2 years earlier by Damien under the pretext of a budget restructuring. Adrian had picked up the phone on the second ring and said, "I've been waiting for this call." She had not told Damien anything. She had gone home to the penthouse every evening, made dinner, asked about his day, and sat across from him at the dinner table while internally constructing the case that was going to take everything from him. That had required a performance she had not known she was capable of. Damien was perceptive when it came to people. He had built his entire life on the skill of reading rooms. And there were moments at dinner, or in the car, or lying awake next to him at 2 in the morning when she was convinced he could see something had changed in her. He would look at her a beat too long or ask a question that seemed innocent but landed with strange weight, and her stomach would drop. But he saw what he expected to see, a woman who was uncertain of herself, a woman who needed him. He had spent 4 years building that image in his own mind, and it had made him, in the end, incautious. He had stopped being careful about Celeste 3 months before he filed for divorce. Celeste Monroe was 29 and worked in wealth management at a firm in River North. She was not, as far as Evelyn could determine, a bad person in the abstract sense. She was a woman who had made the specific choice to involve herself with a married man and had told herself, as people in those situations often did, a version of events that made her the romantic lead rather than the supporting character in someone else's disaster. Damien had met her at a client dinner. Evelyn had found out about the affair not through some dramatic revelation, but through the mundane machinery of financial discovery. Adrian, while tracking the movement of money through Damien's shell companies, had flagged a recurring payment to a luxury apartment building in the Gold Coast. Margaret had sent an investigator. The investigator had done his job. Evelyn had looked at the photographs for a long time, not with the wild, shattering emotion she might have expected, with something quieter and colder and far more dangerous. She had called Margaret the next morning and said, "I want to begin the filing process." What Evelyn had not told Margaret, not yet, not until she was certain, was what she had found inside her father's trust documents during the months of discovery. Gerald Holt, Leonard's personal attorney, was elderly now and had retired to Scottsdale, but he was not dead, and he was not without conscience, and when Evelyn had reached him by phone and described what was happening, he had been very quiet for a long moment and then said, "Your father knew, Evelyn. He didn't know it would be Damien, specifically. But he knew." What did he do? He built something into the trust. I've been holding it for 3 years. I wasn't sure it would ever be necessary. Another pause. Bring your attorney to Scottsdale. Bring no one else. The courtroom on the 43rd floor of the Daly Center had high windows and terrible acoustics, and the particular atmosphere of a room where a great deal of human unhappiness had been processed without resolution. Judge Patricia Ware had presided over complex divorce litigation for 16 years and had developed the specific affect of someone who had heard nearly everything and was still, against all expectation, capable of surprise. Damien arrived with his lead attorney, a man named Stephen Kraft, who was known for his aggression in asset negotiation and his absolute confidence in his own intelligence. Kraft had been telling Damien for 3 weeks that this was going to be straightforward. The prenuptial agreement was airtight. The corporate assets were protected. Damien's position at Whitmore Global, established through years of operational leadership during a period of documented executive transition, was defensible. "You're going to walk out of here with more than you came in with," Kraft had said, and Damien had believed him because Damien always believed the people who told him what he wanted to hear. Celeste was not in the courtroom. She was waiting in the lobby of a restaurant 3 blocks away, and Damien had texted her at 8:45. "Should be done by noon. Save us a table somewhere good." Evelyn sat on the opposite side of the aisle with Margaret, who wore a gray suit and carried a leather portfolio and had the calm, unhurried energy of someone who was not worried about how this was going to go. The hearing began. Kraft performed. He was good at performing, the kind of attorney who makes procedural arguments sound like moral philosophy, who uses the word equitable frequently and with great feeling. He outlined Damien's contributions to Whitmore Global, the years of leadership during a difficult transition period, the contractual basis for his stake in the company's operational assets. Evelyn listened and said nothing and watched the clock. At 9:57, Margaret rose. "Your Honor, before we proceed to asset division, I need to present a document that was filed with this court 3 days ago and which has direct bearing on every item in the opposing counsel's proposal." Kraft looked up from his notes. "What document?" "A sealed addendum to the Leonard Whitmore Family Trust," Margaret said, "filed with this court under seal in accordance with the trust's own instructions and activated upon the verified conditions of adultery-initiated divorce." The room shifted. Kraft was on his feet. "Your Honor, we have not been made aware of any sealed—" "That's the nature of a sealed document, Mr. Kraft," Judge Ware said with the particular dryness of a woman who had been on the bench for a long time. "Bailiff, please retrieve the envelope from the court's records office. We'll take a 15-minute recess." Damien leaned toward Kraft. His voice was low, but not low enough. "What the hell is this?" "I don't know," Kraft said. "I've never heard of a sealed trust addendum being—" "Then find out." "Damien, find out." Evelyn did not turn around. The recess lasted 22 minutes. When Judge Ware returned, she was carrying a sealed manila envelope with a court registry stamp from 3 days prior and a secondary stamp Evelyn recognized, the notarial seal of Gerald Holt, attorney at law, Scottsdale, Arizona. The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Ware opened the envelope with a letter opener, removed 3 pages of legal text, and read them in silence for 4 minutes while everyone waited. Then she looked up. "Mr. Kraft," she said, "I'm going to need you to sit down. Your Honor, if there's a document affecting my client's rights, we are entitled to— You will receive a copy in approximately 90 seconds. Sit down." Kraft sat. Judge Ware set the pages on her bench and looked at the room over her reading glasses. "The Leonard Whitmore Family Trust contains a conditional asset reversion clause executed and notarized in the presence of 2 witnesses in January of the year prior to Mr. Whitmore's death. She paused. The clause states, in summary, that in the event Evelyn Whitmore's spouse initiates divorce proceedings while a documented extramarital relationship is ongoing, all Whitmore estate assets, including equity positions, real property, offshore holdings, and corporate shares, revert in full to Evelyn Whitmore, unconditionally, effective upon the court's verification of the triggering conditions. She set the pages down. The court has received, as part of the sealed filing, a signed affidavit from a licensed private investigator documenting Mr. Cross's relationship with Celeste Monroe, which predates the divorce filing by 14 months. The triggering conditions have been met. Damien said, out loud, in the middle of the courtroom. That's not possible. His voice was strange. Not angry, exactly. Stunned in a way that anger hadn't caught up with yet. Mr. Cross, Judge Ware said, that document, my attorneys reviewed the trust. There was nothing. The addendum was sealed and held by the original trust attorney, Margaret said, standing. It was not part of the documents provided during discovery because it was specifically designed to be unavailable until the triggering conditions were verified. The original trust attorney, Gerald Holt, will provide testimony this afternoon if the court requires it. Kraft had gone a color that wasn't quite white. He was reading the copy that had been handed to him, and whatever he was reading, it was changing the expression on his face in increments. Damien grabbed his arm. Stephen, tell me this isn't— I need a moment, Kraft said. I don't need you to need a moment. I need you to fix this. Damien. Kraft looked at him, and whatever was in his face made Damien stop talking. I need to read this. The courtroom waited. Damien sat back in his chair, and for the first time that Evelyn could remember, she watched him not know what to do with his hands. She had thought, in the months of preparation, that watching him fall apart would feel like something— satisfaction, maybe, or relief, or the particular cold satisfaction of seeing a wrong thing corrected. What she felt instead, sitting there while he tried to find his footing and couldn't, was something more complicated and harder to name. There was no cleanness to it. He had taken years from her. He had taken her confidence and her position and her sense of herself and her father's company, and he had done all of it deliberately and without remorse. And watching him unravel in a Chicago courtroom did not give those years back. But then Margaret reached into her portfolio and removed a small evidence bag containing a USB drive, and Evelyn thought, this part is for my father. Your Honor, at this time the petitioner would also like to introduce recorded evidence obtained through discovery. Margaret approached the bench. Security footage from the executive offices at Whitmore Global recorded on 3 separate dates, capturing conversations between Mr. Cross and Miss Monroe in which both parties explicitly discussed the mechanics of the asset diversion scheme, the purpose of the Meridian Freight Partners entity, and the fraudulent rerouting of Whitmore Global international contracts. Kraft was on his feet again. Your Honor, the provenance of this footage needs to be established before— The footage was recorded by the building's own security system, Margaret said. Mr. Cross authorized the system's installation in 2021. He is recorded in his own office. On cameras he approved. The chain of custody is documented in the filing. Judge Ware looked at Kraft. Do you have a substantive objection, counselor, or would you like to continue spending everyone's time? A long pause. No substantive objection, Kraft said. The bailiff connected the drive to the courtroom's display system. The monitors, 4 of them, positioned throughout the room, flickered to life. And there was Damien, 3 months ago, sitting behind the desk that had been Leonard Whitmore's, laughing. And there was Celeste, in the chair across from him that had been Leonard Whitmore's, laughing with him. And Damien's voice coming through the courtroom speakers with perfect, terrible clarity. By the time she figures out what happened to the Singapore contracts, we'll be in Lisbon. She can barely read a balance sheet. Leonard spent 30 years building this and left it to someone who can't find it on a map. The room was very quiet. Celeste's voice on the recording. What about the board? Damien. I own 4 of the 7 votes. The other 3 are going to be very surprised when they find out what the severance agreement looks like. A short, satisfied sound. Gerald built a trust for a grieving daughter. I built a company for myself. Those are different things. The monitor went dark. Evelyn looked straight ahead. Across the aisle, Damian Cross sat in his chair and stared at the middle distance and said absolutely nothing. His phone, on the table in front of him, buzzed twice. Celeste, probably, wondering why he hadn't texted, wondering about the table he was supposed to be saving. Judge Ware removed her glasses and set them on her bench. "We're going to take a 2-hour recess," she said, "during which I will be on the phone with the U.S. Attorney's office." She looked directly at Damian. "Mr. Cross, I would strongly suggest you use that time to consult with your attorney about the implications of what this court has just seen and heard, and I would further suggest that you do not leave this building." Stephen Kraft gathered his papers with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who was already calculating how quickly he could withdraw from this case. Damian looked at Evelyn for the first time all morning. She met his eyes. She did not smile. She did not look away. She just looked at him. The way you look at something you used to be afraid of, once you've stopped being afraid. Then she turned back to Margaret, who was already on her phone, and said very quietly, "Call Adrian. Tell him they're going to move on the building within the hour." Margaret nodded and stepped into the hallway. Evelyn sat alone for a moment at the long table, with the lake somewhere out there beyond the windows, flat and enormous and indifferent in the way her father had always loved. She thought of him, of the sealed envelope he had prepared in the year before his death for a disaster he had hoped would never come, of the word he had used when Gerald Holt described the clause to her, safeguard. Not revenge, not trap, safeguard. He had done what he could for her. From a distance, across years, through the particular machinery of legal documents and sealed envelopes, and a trust attorney who had held a secret for 3 years without breaking, she had done the rest herself. That was the part she would need to remember later. When the case was finished and the company was hers, and the space where her grief used to be had turned into something she didn't have a word for yet, she had done the rest herself. The 2-hour recess did not feel like 2 hours. Evelyn sat in a small conference room on the 41st floor that Margaret had reserved for exactly this purpose, away from the hallway, away from the elevators, away from the particular theater of watching Damian Cross try to manage a situation that had moved beyond managing. A paralegal brought coffee. Evelyn drank half of it. Margaret was on her phone for most of the first hour, speaking in the low, clipped sentences she used when she was working through logistics rather than performing for anyone's benefit. Evelyn looked at her own hands on the table and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of exhaustion. She had been preparing for this morning for 8 months. 8 months of careful, compartmentalized work. The evidence gathering, the document retrieval, the late nights with Adrian going through transaction records that Damian had buried under 3 layers of corporate structuring. 8 months of sitting across from her husband at dinner and asking how his day had gone. She had expected, when it finally arrived, to feel something large and defining. Instead, she felt hollowed out in a way that was different from grief but adjacent to it. Like a room after furniture has been removed, the space was there, the outlines of where things used to be were visible, but it wasn't yet clear what would fill it. Margaret ended her call and sat down across from her. U.S. Attorney's Office has been briefed, she said. They've been building a parallel case on the Meridian accounts for 5 months. Our evidence accelerates their timeline significantly. How significantly? They were looking at an indictment in the fall. Now they're talking about moving before the end of the month. Evelyn nodded slowly. And the board? Pauline has been in contact with 3 of the independent directors this morning. Once the asset reversion is formalized by Judge Ware, which I expect to happen this afternoon, your controlling stake is restored. You'll need to call an emergency board session within 72 hours to address the operational transition. The 4 votes Damian bought, but 2 of them have already called Pauline. They're not going to be a problem. Margaret paused. People are very good at remembering their loyalties when the wind changes direction. Evelyn looked at her. Is that supposed to make me feel better or worse? Neither, Margaret said. It's just true. She set her pen down. How are you holding up? I don't know yet. Evelyn turned her coffee cup in her hands. Ask me tonight. Across the building, in a conference room 3 floors up, Damian Cross was having the worst conversation of his life, and it was only getting worse. Stephen Kraft had spent the first 40 minutes of the recess reading and rereading the sealed trust addendum, cross-referencing it against the documents from the original trust filing, and coming to a conclusion he did not want to share with his client because his client was not handling the morning well. Damien had not sat down since they'd entered the room. He was moving, not pacing exactly, but orbiting the table in a way that made the paralegal in the corner visibly uncomfortable. "It's forged," he said. "That's the only explanation. Leonard never told me about any reversion clause. Gerald Holt never—" "Damien," Kraft's voice was flat. "Stop. I'm telling you, Holt was compromised. Evelyn got to him somehow. The document is notarized with witnesses, filed with the court 3 days ago by an attorney with a 40-year clean record in the state of Arizona." Kraft set the papers down. "I have reviewed every word. It is not forged." Then it was added later, after Leonard died. "The notarial date is January of the year before Leonard died. That date was verified by the court's own registry." Kraft looked at him directly. "It's real, Damien. Whatever you thought was in that trust, this was also in it. Leonard Whitmore put a loaded gun in a drawer and told his attorney to fire it if you ever did exactly what you did." Damien stopped moving. He stood at the window, a view of Lower Michigan Avenue, taxicabs and pedestrians, and the ordinary machinery of a city that did not know or care what was happening on the 43rd floor, and was very quiet for a moment. "The footage," he said finally. "What about it? Can we challenge the chain of custody?" Adrian Thorne had access to that system. He authorized the system, Kraft said. As executive director of operations, he signed off on the building security infrastructure in 2021. The footage is time-stamped and unedited. We would need to demonstrate tampering, and we have no basis for that claim. Damien put one hand flat against the window glass. "What are my options?" It wasn't a question, exactly. It was the kind of sentence a man produces when he already suspects the answer and is asking someone else to say it so he doesn't have to. Kraft was quiet for a moment. "On the civil side, very limited. The asset reversion clause is going to hold. Judge Ware is going to formalize it this afternoon, and there is not a viable appellate argument I can construct in the next 2 hours." He paused. "On the criminal side, that is a different matter, and it is not my area. You need to call a criminal defense attorney before this recess ends. I need you to fix this." "I can't fix this." "Stephen, I have been your attorney for 9 years, Kraft said, and his voice was not unkind, but it was very firm. "I am telling you as your attorney, and I am telling you as someone who has sat across from you in a lot of rooms, that what happened in that courtroom this morning cannot be fixed by me or by anyone else in the civil litigation space. The question now is whether you are going to face what's coming with some degree of preparation, or whether you're going to spend the next 2 hours telling me it's forged." Damien turned from the window. He looked at Kraft with the expression of a man encountering, for possibly the first time, the specific experience of having run out of moves. "Call Marcus Webb," Kraft said. "He's the best criminal defense attorney in this city. I'll give you his direct line. Call him now before you say another word to anyone." Damien's phone was in his hand. He had 14 texts from Celeste. He hadn't opened any of them. Pauline Dre had been sitting in the Whitmore Global lobby for 2 hours when her phone rang. She was not supposed to be at the office. She had taken personal leave for the day, officially. But the office was where she had worked for 11 years. And it was where her instincts had taken her when she woke up at 5 in the morning, knowing that today was the day. And she had sat in the lobby with a coffee and a newspaper she wasn't reading, watching the front desk staff move through their morning routines without knowing what was happening 3 miles away in a courtroom. The call was from Margaret Osei's office. "It's going the way we expected," the paralegal on the line said. "Judge Ware received the document. The recess is running." Pauline let out a breath she had been holding, apparently, for 8 months. "Any word on Cross?" "His attorney is still with him. He hasn't left the building." "Okay." Pauline stood up from the lobby chair and moved to the window. Michigan Avenue below, the same view Leonard had chosen 30 years ago when he built this company into something worth protecting. "Tell Margaret I'm in position. I'll be here when it's time." She ended the call and stood at the window for a moment. One of the junior analysts, a young man named Derek, who had only been with the company for 7 months, noticed her and did a double take. "Ms. Dre? I thought you were out today." "I am out," she said. "I'm just standing here." He blinked. "Okay." She turned back to the window. Outside, the city kept moving. The thing about Adrian Thorne was that he didn't look like someone who had spent 2 years quietly building a case. He looked like what he had always looked like: tall, slightly rumpled, the kind of man who kept a screwdriver in his jacket pocket out of habit and forgot it was there until airport security. He had built Whitmore Global's cybersecurity infrastructure from the ground up under Leonard's direction, had been the quiet technical conscience of the company for a decade, and had been pushed out by Damien in a budget meeting that lasted 20 minutes and left no room for argument. He had not been gracious about it. He had been furious, privately and specifically, in the way that people who have given a decade to something are furious when it is taken from them by someone who doesn't understand what it's worth. He had also, being Adrian, kept copies of everything. Not illegally. That was important. He had been careful about that, careful in a way that Evelyn's attorney had verified twice before incorporating his work into the case. Everything he had retained as the system's architect, using access that was legitimately his at the time of his departure. Damien had moved him out quickly, which meant certain oversight procedures hadn't been followed, which meant certain administrative credentials had expired on Damien's timeline rather than the company's proper offboarding schedule. Adrian had flagged this to 2 members of the IT department on his last day. Neither of them had escalated it. He had made a note of that too. Now he was sitting in a coffee shop 4 blocks from the Daily Center, working on his 3rd black coffee, waiting for Margaret's call. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. They've seen the footage. Recess until noon. Be ready. He set the phone face down and looked out the window at the street. He thought about Leonard, the way he often did when things were moving toward some kind of conclusion. Leonard Whitmore had not been a perfect man. He had been demanding and occasionally cold, and had held his company to standards he didn't always apply to himself. But he had also been, in the specific and important way, someone who understood what he was building. Not just a logistics company, a mechanism, a way of moving things from where they were to where they needed to be. He had believed that was genuinely valuable work, and he had done it with a seriousness that Adrian had respected. Damien had never believed that. Damien had seen the company as an asset to be extracted, which was a different thing entirely. Adrian's phone buzzed again. Evelyn needs the Meridian files ready for federal handoff. Can you have everything packaged by 2? He typed back. Already done. Been ready for 3 weeks. A pause. Then Margaret. Of course you have. He almost smiled. The afternoon session began at 12:40. Judge Ware came back to the bench with the particular economy of movement of someone who had made her decision during the recess and was not interested in revisiting it. She settled her papers, looked at both tables, and began. The court has reviewed the Leonard Whitmore Family Trust Addendum in its entirety, including the notarial record and the witness documentation filed alongside it. I have also spoken with Gerald Holt by phone. He is available for telephonic testimony if either party requires it, and his account of the addendum's preparation and execution is consistent with the document itself. She paused. Mr. Kraft, I'll give you the opportunity now to raise any challenge to the document's authenticity or to the applicability of the triggering conditions. Kraft stood. He was a composed man. That was his professional identity. But something around his eyes had changed since the morning session. Your Honor, the petitioner's position is that the terms of the addendum require independent verification of the triggering conditions beyond the investigator's affidavit. We would request, I have the investigator's affidavit, a second corroborating affidavit from a building security contractor, and approximately 12 minutes of video recorded in the respondent's own office, Judge Ware said. How much verification would satisfy you? A pause. We have no further challenge to the document, Kraft said, and sat down. Damien was very still beside him. He had made a phone call during the recess. Marcus Webb had answered and spent 45 minutes with him on the phone, speaking in the measured cadences of a man who understood the terrain. Webb had said, among other things, do not speak in that courtroom this afternoon. Do not look at your wife. Do not react to anything the judge says. You are gathering information right now. That is the only thing you are doing. Damien was trying to do that. He was not succeeding entirely, but he was trying. Judge Ware continued, The court finds the triggering conditions of the Leonard Whitmore Family Trust Reversion Clause to be satisfied. Effective upon the entry of this order, all Whitmore estate assets, including but not limited to equity holdings in Whitmore Global Logistics, real property held under Whitmore estate instruments, offshore holdings identified in the trust schedule, and any assets demonstrably derived from Whitmore estate capital, revert to Evelyn. Whitmore unconditionally. She looked up. The prenuptial agreement between the parties is superseded by the trust instrument on all estate-related matters. The court will enter a formal order this afternoon. The courtroom clerk was typing. Margaret put her hand briefly on Evelyn's arm. Not a dramatic gesture, just a quiet acknowledgement, and then took her hand away. Evelyn looked at the judge and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Furthermore, Judge Ware said, given the video evidence presented this morning, I am referring this matter to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. The court will preserve all exhibits. Both parties are ordered to remain available for federal contact. She set her pen down. We will address the remaining divorce proceeding elements in a continued session pending the federal review. Court is in recess. The gavel came down. Kraft was already leaning toward Damien, speaking quietly and urgently. Damien was sitting with his hands flat on the table, looking at nothing, in the posture of a man who has just watched the floor disappear beneath him and hasn't yet figured out where he's going to land. Evelyn stood, gathered her portfolio, and walked out of the courtroom without looking at him. She didn't make it to the elevator before her phone rang. It was Pauline. 2 federal vehicles just pulled up in front of the building, Pauline said. Her voice was careful, controlled in the way it always was when she was processing something large. 4 agents in the lobby. They're asking for access to the executive floor. Let them in, Evelyn said. Evelyn. A pause. Are you... How did it go? It went the way it was supposed to. She pushed the elevator button. Is Adrian there? He just walked in. He has a case with him. Good. Don't let the agents into the server room until Adrian is with them. He knows what they need. Understood. Another pause, shorter. The building's yours again. Evelyn stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. For a moment she was alone in the small mirrored space, and she looked at herself. The gray suit, the dark circles she'd covered imperfectly, the single strand of hair that had come loose from its clip sometime during the morning session. She looked like someone who had been through something. That was okay. She had been. The elevator opened into the lobby and she walked through it and out the front doors into the October afternoon. The air hit her, cold and sharp off the lake, and she stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and just breathed. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it. This is Celeste Monroe. I know you have no reason to respond to this. I just need you to know that I didn't know about the fraud. I knew about us. I didn't know about the rest of it. I'm not asking for anything. I just didn't want you to think I was part of that. Evelyn read it twice. She put her phone in her pocket and walked toward the parking structure where Margaret's car was waiting. She'd decide later what to do with that. Maybe nothing. Maybe it didn't matter what Celeste had known or hadn't known. Maybe it did. That was a question for a day when she had more room to think about it, which was not today. Today had used everything she had. The federal agents had arrived at Whitmore Global with a search warrant that was 4 pages long and covered the executive suite, the finance department's servers, and the specific set of Meridian Freight Partners documentation that Adrian had already organized and labeled in a red binder that he handed to the lead agent, a compact woman named Special Agent Torres, before she had finished introducing herself. Torres looked at the binder, looked at Adrian. You prepared this for us? I prepared it because I knew you'd need it, Adrian said. I've been keeping a parallel record for 22 months. Everything's labeled. The wire transfer documentation starts on page 47. The Cayman registry filings are tabbed in blue. Torres opened the binder to page 47. She looked at it for a moment. Mr. Thorne, she said, have you ever considered working for the federal government? I considered it, Adrian said. The coffee's worse. She almost smiled. We're going to need a few hours with you. I've got all afternoon. Pauline was standing near the window of the main conference room, watching the agents move through the floor with the particular controlled efficiency of people who had done this before. She had a strange feeling in her chest. Not quite relief, not quite grief. Closer to the feeling you get when something that has been wrong for a long time finally starts moving toward being right, and you realize how long you've been waiting for it to move. One of the younger agents, he couldn't have been more than 30, approached her. "Ma'am, are you the director of compliance?" "I am." "We're going to need access to the internal audit records from the past 4 years. I've been compiling them since yesterday," she said. "They're on a drive on my desk. I'll take you there." She walked him down the hall, past the offices, past the conference rooms, past the corner office at the end that still had Leonard Whitmore's name on a small brass plate beside the door because no one had gotten around to replacing it yet, or perhaps because no one had wanted to. She was going to leave that plate where it was. She made that decision in the hallway, for no reason she could fully articulate, and then let it go and focused on the task at hand. Damien arrived at Whitmore Global Headquarters at 2:15. He shouldn't have. Marcus Webb had told him explicitly not to. "Do not go to the building today. Do not attempt to access any company systems or physical records. You are making things worse for yourself if you do." Webb had said it twice, and Damien had said he understood, and then had gotten into his car and driven there anyway, because the understanding hadn't reached whatever part of him was still in disbelief. He pulled into the parking structure and sat in his car for a full 5 minutes. He had a key card. He had always had a key card. He had been the operational director of this company for 3 years and had walked through those doors hundreds of times and had never once thought about what it would feel like if the key card didn't work. He got out of the car. He walked across the parking structure and through the side entrance and held his card up to the reader by the elevator. The reader blinked red. He tried it again. Red. He stood there for a moment with the card in his hand. A security guard appeared around the corner. Not the usual afternoon guard. Someone Damien didn't recognize, which meant Torres's team had brought their own building security. The guard looked at him without particular hostility. "Can I help you, sir?" "I work here," Damien said, and even as he said it, he understood that he was using the wrong tense. "Your name?" "Damien Cross. I'm the director of operations." The guard looked at something on a tablet, looked at Damien. "Mr. Cross, I'm going to need to ask you to wait here for a moment. I need access to the executive floor. I have documents." "Sir," the guard's voice was still even, "I need you to wait here. I'll get someone who can speak with you." Damien looked at the elevator, looked at the red light on the keycard reader, looked at the security guard with his tablet, and then Special Agent Torres came around the corner from the lobby. She looked at Damien for a moment with the expression of someone who is unsurprised but still faintly interested. "Mr. Cross," she said, "I was wondering if you'd show up. I need access to my office." "You don't have an office here anymore," Torres said. "As of this afternoon's court order, this building's assets are under Evelyn Whitmore's control, and this floor is under active federal warrant. You are not permitted past this point." Damien looked at her. "I have personal items in that office. We'll arrange for those to be inventoried and returned to you. That's standard procedure." She paused. "Is there something specific you came here for, Mr. Cross? Because I should be honest with you. Anything you say to me right now, I am going to remember." He said nothing. "That's a smart choice," Torres said. "I'd recommend going home. I'd recommend calling your attorney. I'd recommend being available for contact from our office, because we're going to have a lot of questions for you in the next few days." Damien stood in the parking structure of the building he had controlled for 3 years, in front of an elevator he no longer had access to, and the full weight of the morning finished arriving. It had been coming all day. He had been holding it at some distance through sheer force of habit, the habit of men who have always found a way through, who have always had another card to play. But there were no more cards. The trust clause had closed one door, the footage had closed another. And standing here in the parking structure with a federal agent watching him hold a key card that no longer worked, the last of the distance collapsed. He put the card in his pocket. He said, "I'll be in touch with your office," in the voice of a man who was maintaining form on the outside and had nothing left on the inside. Then he walked back to his car. Evelyn got the call from Torres at 3:40. She was in Margaret's office by then, working through the documentation for the board notification, trying to keep her focus on the operational rather than the personal because the operational was something she could actually move through. "He came to the building," Torres said. He's gone now. I wanted you to know." "Did he say anything?" "Not much. He was trying to hold it together." Torres paused. "I've been doing this for 16 years. The ones who come back to the building, it's not really about the office. It's the last place they felt like themselves. They come back to see if it's real." Evelyn thought about that. "Is there anything I need to do right now?" she asked. "Stay accessible. We'll be in contact within 48 hours to schedule a formal interview. You'll be a witness, not a subject, but we'll need your account of the timeline. Your attorney should be present." Torres paused again. "Miss Whitmore, the Meridian documentation your people provided, the scope of what he moved through those accounts is significant. This is going to be a substantial case." "I know. People are going to want to know how you didn't see it sooner." It was a blunt thing to say, and Evelyn respected it for that. "I know that too." "For what it's worth," Torres said, "from what I've read today, you saw it when you were in a position to act on it. That's what matters." She ended the call and set her phone on Margaret's desk. Margaret was watching her from across the room. "You should eat something," she said. "You haven't eaten anything since this morning." "I know." "There's a sandwich place 2 blocks down. They're still open." Evelyn looked at her. "Are you asking me to go get a sandwich?" "I'm telling you that normal human activities are still available to you. Food is one of them." Margaret took her glasses off and set them down. "This part is over, Evelyn. The next part doesn't start until tomorrow. Tonight, you can just be a person." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. It had been so long since the space between things felt safe enough to inhabit. The 8 months of preparation, the vigilance, the performance of normalcy inside her own marriage, it had taken up so much of the architecture of her daily life that she didn't quite know what shape the life had underneath it. "Okay," she said. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. "One condition," she said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You're coming with me. I'm not sitting in a sandwich place alone on the worst and best day of my life." Margaret considered this for exactly 2 seconds. "Fine," she said, "but I'm ordering the soup." They walked out together into the Chicago evening, the wind off the lake doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous, and somehow, in the specific way of cold October air, exactly right. The sandwich place was called Pharaoh's, and it had been there since the 90s, and the soup was cream of tomato with a kind of unpretentious thickness that suggested someone had actually made it that morning rather than opened a can. Margaret ate hers with focused appreciation. Evelyn worked through half a turkey sandwich and found, to her mild surprise, that she was hungry in the specific way that follows the end of something enormous. The body deciding, now that the emergency was over, to remind you it exists. They didn't talk about the case for the first 20 minutes. Margaret asked about Evelyn's mother, who was living in Evanston and had been kept carefully away from the details of the past 8 months for her own peace of mind. Evelyn said she was fine, that she'd called her this morning before court, that she'd told her only that the divorce was happening today, and that everything was going to be okay. "Did she believe you?" Margaret asked. "She never quite believes me when I say things are going to be okay. She's been burned too many times by optimism." Evelyn paused. "But she appreciated the call. Are you going to tell her everything?" "Eventually, when there's enough distance that it's a story instead of an open wound." She picked up the second half of her sandwich and put it back down. "She loved my father very much. Finding out how thoroughly Damien undermined what he built, that's going to be hard for her. She still hasn't finished grieving Leonard. This is going to reopen things." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "There's no clean way through that?" "No." They sat with that for a bit. The restaurant had maybe 8 other tables occupied. The low murmur of conversations Evelyn couldn't make out. Someone's kid drawing on a paper placemat with a crayon. Normal Wednesday evening in Chicago. The world continuing its operations unaware that in one small courthouse room this morning, several years of meticulously constructed deception had come apart in approximately 45 minutes. "The board session," Evelyn said finally, because eventually the next day had to start being planned for. "Thursday." "I'd push for Thursday morning," Margaret said, "before anything leaks to the press. Federal investigations have a way of becoming public faster than anyone expects. I need to talk to Pauline tonight, and Adrian. Adrian is still with Torres's team. He texted me an hour ago. They're going through the Meridian documentation in detail. He said to tell you he'll be available tomorrow morning. He's been in there for 6 hours. He's been waiting to do this for 2 years, Margaret said. I don't think he minds. Evelyn thought about Adrian in that conference room with the federal agents, walking them through the trail he'd been quietly maintaining since before she'd even known to ask him. There was something in that. The way the people her father had trusted had held their positions, waiting. Pauline with her suspicions and her silence and her courage in a coffee shop. Adrian with his copies and his patience. Gerald Holt in Scottsdale, holding a sealed envelope for 3 years. Her father had built something more than a company. He had built a network of people who understood what it meant to protect something worth protecting. She just hadn't been able to see it while Damien was standing in the way. Margaret, she said. Thank you for the past 8 months, for all of it. Margaret looked at her over the soup. Don't thank me. You did the work. I built the structure around it. She paused. Also, you're paying me quite a lot of money, so gratitude is somewhat beside the point. I'm thanking you anyway. I know you are. A brief, genuine smile. You're welcome. The next 48 hours had the compressed, slightly unreal quality of time that is moving too fast to be fully absorbed. Evelyn was back in the hotel room by 9 that evening. She sat on the bed with her shoes off and her laptop open and worked through the preliminary board agenda with Pauline over the phone until nearly midnight, the two of them building the framework of an emergency session that would need to accomplish 3 things simultaneously: establish Evelyn's restored authority, address the void left by Damien's operational presence, and contain the narrative before it spread through the company in the destabilizing form of rumor. People know something happened, Pauline said. The federal agents were in the building for 6 hours. Derek from Analytics has already texted me twice asking if there's a merger happening. What did you tell him? That he should focus on his Q3 reconciliation. Good. Can you have the department heads available for a briefing by 8 on Thursday? Most of them. Hargrove is in London. He can dial in. Chen is going to be a problem. Richard Chen was one of the board members who had voted with Damien on the key operational restructuring 3 years ago that had formalized Damien's executive authority. He was 67, careful, politically sophisticated in the specific way of men who have spent 40 years reading which way the room is moving and adjusting accordingly. He had called Pauline that afternoon, which told Evelyn something useful about his instincts. What kind of problem? Evelyn asked. The kind that's already trying to figure out which side of this he should have been on all along. Let him figure it out. I'd rather have him in the tent asking questions than outside it making noise. Evelyn closed one document and opened another. What's the operational status of the Singapore contracts? Pauline was quiet for a moment. Currently routed through Meridian, which means they're effectively frozen until the federal warrant sorts out what can be moved and what can't. The Singapore partners have been notified there's an administrative review. They're not happy. How not happy? Marcus Tan called me directly this afternoon. Marcus Tan was the managing director of Pacific Rim Freight, the Singapore anchor partner that Leonard had built a 20-year relationship with. He was diplomatic about it, but the subtext was very clear. They want to know who they're dealing with. Call him back tomorrow morning. Tell him to expect a formal communication from me personally by end of week. He's going to want more than a communication. Then after the board session, we'll fly to Singapore. Evelyn stopped typing for a moment. Can you get there on short notice? A pause. You want me to come with you? I want you to come with me. Another pause. And in it, Evelyn could hear Pauline recalibrating in some way, absorbing the shift from the woman she had been carefully protective of for a year to the woman now giving instructions at midnight with a legal war barely 24 hours in the rear view. Yes, Pauline said, I can get there. The board meeting on Thursday morning was scheduled for 8. Evelyn arrived at the Whitmore Global building at 6:45. She stood outside on Michigan Avenue for a moment, looking up at the facade. 32 floors. The building wasn't the largest thing in that section of the street. There were taller, newer buildings on either side of it, but it had a particular weight to it, a kind of solidity that she associated entirely with her father, who had chosen it and occupied it and had sat at the top of it for 3 decades like a man who understood that some things were worth the trouble of keeping. The lobby guard, the company's own security, not Torres's team, who had finished their preliminary sweep the day before, recognized her and held the door. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore." She had not been called that in this building in a long time. Damien had moved through it as the de facto authority for so long that the staff had developed the habit of directing operational questions to him, speaking to Evelyn with a particular careful deference that was the professional version of handling someone fragile. She had allowed it because she had believed for a time that it was accurate. "Good morning," she said, and walked through the lobby to the elevator. Her office, Leonard's office, the one that still had the brass plate, was on the 32nd floor. She hadn't been in it in 8 months. She had avoided it during the preparation period because going in and coming out again without being able to act would have been unbearable. She stepped off the elevator and walked down the hall and put her hand on the door handle and pushed it open. It was essentially as Leonard had left it. Damien had used the space, obviously. The desk had been rearranged, a second monitor added. Damien's particular organizational logic imposed on the bookshelves in a way that was subtly, but definitely not Leonard's. But the view was the same. The east-facing window that Leonard had chosen specifically for the morning light over the lake. The small framed photograph that Leonard had kept on the credenza. Himself and a group of dock workers at the Port of Chicago, 1987, the year he'd signed his first major contract. Damien had moved the photograph to the back of a shelf. Evelyn found it behind a row of annual reports and set it back on the credenza. Then she sat down behind the desk and opened her laptop and started working. By 7:30, Pauline had arrived with coffee and a folder of department summaries. By 7:50, 5 of the 7 board members were seated in the main conference room 1 floor down. Richard Chen was there, in a suit that said he'd thought carefully about what to wear, sitting in a position that was not quite central and not quite peripheral, the physical expression of a man still determining his alignment. The other uncertain vote was a man named Warren Fitch, who had been brought onto the board by Damien 2 years ago and who had the unhappy look of someone who had just realized that the horse he'd bet on was not going to finish the race. Evelyn walked into the room at 8 o'clock exactly and sat at the head of the table. The shift in the room was immediate and subtle, the kind of recalibration that happens when people who have been operating under one assumption suddenly have to update it. She had sat in this room dozens of times over the past 3 years, always to the side, always in the position Damien had implicitly assigned her, present but not central, consulted but not directing. She had allowed that positioning too. She was done allowing it. She set her portfolio on the table and looked at the room. "I'm going to say this once, clearly, and then we're going to move on to operational matters, because there's a significant amount of work to do." She paused. "As of yesterday afternoon, by order of Judge Patricia Ware in the Circuit Court of Cook County, the Whitmore Estate Asset Reversion Clause has been activated, and all company equity reverts to me in full. The federal investigation currently underway will address the criminal dimensions of what happened here over the past 3 years. The board's role in that will be examined as part of that process. My role today is to stabilize this company and return it to functioning at the level my father built it to function at. That's what we're doing this morning." Silence. Warren Fitch cleared his throat. "Evelyn, Ms. Whitmore, I want to say that in my role on this board, I was not aware of Warren," Evelyn said, not unkindly, but with a specificity that stopped him. "I'm not asking for statements of innocence right now. I'm going to need demonstrated usefulness. That's how you contribute to this process. Understood?" A pause. "Yes," he said. Richard Chen looked at her from his position at the middle of the table with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Then he said, "What's the status of the Singapore contracts?" It was, she realized, a test, not a hostile one. He was checking whether she knew. "Currently frozen pending the federal warrant scope determination. I've spoken with Pauline about the Pacific Rim relationship. I'll be in contact with Marcus Tan personally before end of week, and we'll be flying to Singapore within the next 10 days to address the operational relationship directly." She looked at him. The contracts Damien rerouted through Meridian were worth $94 million over the past 18 months. Reconstructing that relationship is a priority. Chen nodded, once. Something in his posture settled. The meeting ran for 2.5 hours. It was not smooth. There were moments of friction, questions about liability exposure, about how the board's prior votes would be assessed by federal investigators, about the immediate operational chain of command with Damien's role eliminated and no succession plan in place. Evelyn answered what she could answer, deferred what required legal review, and made two decisions in the room that she had not planned to make but that the conversation required. She named Pauline as interim chief operating officer, effective immediately, and she announced that the company would retain outside auditors to conduct a full review of all decisions made under Damien's operational authority. That second decision landed with a particular weight. It meant every board member's votes were going under examination. Some of them knew exactly what that meant for them. Some of them didn't know yet, but would soon. "That's going to be disruptive," said James Okafor, the board's longest-serving independent director. A man Leonard had trusted and who had, to his credit, been the most consistent dissenting vote against Damien's restructuring proposals. "Yes," Evelyn said. "It's also necessary." Okafor looked at her for a moment. He had known her since she was a child, had sat at her father's dinner table, had watched her grow up in the proximity of this company without ever quite growing into it. Not because she wasn't capable, but because the space had been taken before she could step into it. "Your father would be satisfied," he said. It was quiet enough that only the people closest to him heard it, and he hadn't said it for effect. He'd said it because it was true, and because he thought she should know. Evelyn looked at him. "I know," she said. "Let's keep going." Tut. The press found out about the federal investigation on Friday morning. It was faster than Margaret had predicted and slower than Torres had warned. The Chicago Tribune ran a brief item citing unnamed sources about a federal inquiry into the finances of Whitmore Global Logistics and the arrest of a former executive. The word arrest surprised Evelyn. She had not known an arrest had been made. She called Torres at 7:15. "We picked up Damien Cross this morning at 6, Torres said. "His apartment on Erie Street. He was there. He didn't run, to his credit." "What are the charges?" "Wire fraud, corporate fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering. There'll be additional charges as we work through the Meridian documentation. Adrian's files are extraordinarily thorough." A pause. "He has Marcus Webb as his criminal defense attorney, which means he'll make bail and will be in the early stages of a very long process. But the charges are solid." Evelyn stood at the window of Leonard's office, her office, looking out at the lake in the gray Friday morning light. Did he say anything?" "Nothing on record. He asked for Webb immediately and didn't speak after that." Torres paused again. "Do you want to know, or would you rather not?" "I want to know." He looked tired. That's really all there was to it. Not the way people look in movies when they get arrested. No drama, just tired. Evelyn processed that. She wasn't sure what she felt about it. She wasn't sure she felt anything specific, which was its own answer of a kind. The man she had been married to for 8 years, the man who had told her she wasn't capable of running her father's company while he was systematically stealing it, arrested in his apartment on a Friday morning looking tired. There was no satisfaction in that image. There was no real feeling at all, just the flat recognition that it had happened and that it was real, and that this was, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, the right end of something. "Okay," she said. "Thank you for telling me." She ended the call and stood at the window for a while longer. Her phone buzzed. Margaret. Then Pauline. Then a number she recognized as her mother's landline in Evanston. She called her mother first. Ruth Whitmore answered on the second ring, which meant she had already seen the Tribune item, which meant this was going to be a longer conversation than Evelyn was ready for. But there was no way around it. "Evelyn." Her mother's voice had the particular quality of someone who has been up since before the news broke. "Tell me what's happening. All of it. Mom, all of it. I am 71 years old, and I am your mother, and I have been watching something be wrong for 3 years and not knowing what, and I want you to tell me what it was." Evelyn sat down in the chair behind the desk. She looked at the 1987 photograph on the credenza. Her father, 30 years younger, standing at the docks with his first real contract in his hand, surrounded by people who had helped him get there. "Okay," she said. "I'll tell you." And she did. All of it. From the afternoon in the coffee shop with Pauline to the sealed envelope in Gerald Holt's possession, to the morning in the courtroom, to the federal agents in the lobby, to the arrest this morning. She talked for 40 minutes, and her mother listened without interrupting, which was not Ruth Whitmore's usual mode, but which suggested she understood that interrupting would break something. When Evelyn finished, there was a long silence. "Your father knew," her mother said. Not a question. He suspected. He prepared for it. He never told me. Something in her voice, not quite hurt, more like the particular ache of discovering that someone you knew completely also held a room you'd never been allowed into. He must have been carrying that alone. He couldn't know if it would ever be necessary. He was protecting the possibility of you never needing to know. Another silence. Then Ruth said quietly, "He spent 30 years protecting things. I used to tease him about it. Said he'd insure his own shadow if the actuary could figure out the math." Despite everything, Evelyn almost smiled. "That sounds like him. Are you all right?" Yes. I'm not the same as I was, but that might be all right too." "That's not a real answer." "No," Evelyn agreed. "It's the only one I have right now. Come to Evanston this weekend. Let me feed you something that isn't hotel food." Evelyn looked at her desk, the stack of files, the board agenda, the Singapore correspondence she needed to draft, the approximately 47 things that needed her attention before end of week. "Saturday," she said. "I'll come Saturday." "Good." A pause. "Bring your appetite. I'm making the pot roast." "Mom." "What?" "I love you." A beat. Ruth Whitmore was not, by nature, a sentimental woman. She had loved her husband and her daughter in the particular way of people who show it through action more than language. But she said simply and directly, "I love you too. Now go run the company." The press coverage intensified over the following week in the way that financial scandal coverage always does. Initial reports giving way to analysis, giving way to opinion, the story accumulating context and contradiction as more reporters picked at it. The name Whitmore Global appeared in the Tribune, the Sun-Times, the Wall Street Journal. A financial news network ran a segment titled "Executive Arrested in Massive Logistics Fraud Scheme" that used a photograph of Damien from a gala 2 years ago in which he looked exactly like what he had wanted to look like: successful, assured, untouchable. Evelyn did not watch the coverage. She was too busy to watch the coverage. There was a company to put back together, and the putting back together was harder and more granular than the dramatic courtroom morning had made it feel. Endless detail work, operational decisions that required her to understand systems she had been systematically excluded from understanding for 3 years. Conversations with department heads who were watching her carefully, waiting to know who she actually was when the emergency was over and the day-to-day began. She made mistakes. She knew she was making them. She made a call on the Chicago-Detroit freight routing that Pauline gently corrected 2 days later with the specific diplomatic precision of someone who was trying to help without undermining. She sat in a meeting with the company's insurance brokers and felt, about 40 minutes in, the cold clarity of realizing she didn't have the background to evaluate what they were telling her and that she was going to have to say so, which she did, and which felt terrible, and which was the right thing. She called Adrian and asked him to teach her the cybersecurity infrastructure he had built, not the technical depths. She wasn't there yet and knew it, but the shape of it, how it worked, what it protected, and why. Adrian had shown up at the office with a whiteboard marker and spent 3 hours walking her through it with the patient, specific manner of someone who had been waiting to have this conversation with someone who actually wanted to understand rather than just appear informed. She hired 2 new department heads from outside the company, over the quiet objections of 2 board members who would have preferred internal promotions and who she listened to and thanked, and then proceeded past. Because the internal promotions they were suggesting were people who had been in the building during Damien's operational period without raising any flags, and that was not a qualification she found compelling. She wasn't always right. She was trying to be, which was different. 3 weeks after the divorce hearing, she finally went back to the penthouse. Not to live there. She had found an apartment in Lincoln Park, smaller than anything she had lived in since her 20s, with windows that faced the park and a kitchen that needed work and enough distance from the Michigan Avenue life she and Damien had built together that it felt at least atmospherically, like something different. But the penthouse still contained things that were hers. The movers needed her there to direct them. She stood in the living room for a moment before the movers arrived. It was a beautiful space. She could admit that now, without the complicated feeling that beauty in a context with Damien always produced. High ceilings, south-facing views, the kind of natural light that costs a specific amount of money in Chicago real estate and that her father would have found absurdly extravagant. She walked through the room slowly. The study where she had spent evenings reading while Damien was at the office late, which she had later understood meant he was with Celeste. The kitchen where they had made breakfast on Sunday mornings in the first year of the marriage and which had gradually become a space she moved through alone. The bedroom that she had lain awake in at 2 a.m, trying to determine whether her suspicions were accurate or whether she was, as Damien had implied many times in many ways, someone who read situations incorrectly. She wasn't someone who read situations incorrectly. She had read this one correctly and had not trusted herself enough to act on it sooner. That was a fact she was going to have to carry, and she didn't need to resolve how she felt about it today. She just needed to acknowledge it existed. She stopped in the study at the small bookshelf where she kept the books that were hers from before the marriage, the ones she'd had in her apartment, that she'd carried into this life. Her father's copy of a collection of essays by a Chicago architect, the spine cracked from use. A novel she'd been given the year she turned 30 and had read 4 times. A small framed sketch, pen and ink, that she had made herself in an art class she'd taken at the Art Institute at 26, in a period of her life when she had been figuring things out and had found that drawing helped her think. She had stopped drawing when she married Damien, not because he told her to, because the space in her head for that kind of thinking had gradually been occupied by other things, the company, the adjustments, the performance of being who Damien needed her to be. She hadn't noticed it disappearing. That was the most honest thing she could say about it. She hadn't noticed. She picked up the small framed sketch and wrapped it carefully in the tissue paper the movers had left on the table. That one was coming with her. The first movers arrived at 9. By noon, the things that were hers were out of the penthouse and on their way to Lincoln Park. She locked the door behind her for the last time and rode the elevator down and walked through the lobby where the doorman, a man named Victor, who had worked the building for 11 years, said, "Goodbye, Ms. Whitmore," in a tone that was more than the professional courtesy it appeared to be on the surface. "Goodbye, Victor," she said. "Take care of yourself." She stepped out onto the street. The Lincoln Park apartment was 20 minutes north. The office was 3 miles south. Her mother's house was 40 minutes up the lake. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk outside the building, the way she had stood on the courthouse steps 3 weeks ago, just letting the air touch her face and not immediately moving toward the next thing. A woman walked past with a dog. 2 men in construction vests crossed against the light. A bus exhaled at the corner. The city operating at its usual register, indifferent in the generous way that cities are indifferent. Not hostile, just already busy, already full of its own noise and need. She hailed a cab. She gave the driver the address of the Lincoln Park apartment, not the office. The office was going to be there in an hour and tomorrow and the day after and every day for however long it took to do what needed doing. It was not going anywhere. She had the whole drive north to sit with the specific, uncomfortable feeling of a life reorganizing around a new center of gravity. Not peace, exactly. Not certainty. Something more provisional and more honest. The sensation of a person who has survived something difficult and has emerged on the other side into ordinary complexity, which is all any recovery actually looks like when you're inside it. She looked out the cab window at the lake running alongside Lakeshore Drive, flat and enormous and unchanging in the way it always was, moving without stopping, not apologizing for the distance it covered. Her father's voice, from somewhere she couldn't locate, "It doesn't stop. It doesn't apologize. It just moves." She moved. The Lincoln Park apartment had a radiator that knocked every morning at 6:15 with the reliability of a bad alarm clock, and Evelyn had decided within the first week that she didn't mind it. The sound was mechanical and honest in a way that the penthouse's silent, climate-controlled perfection had never been. The penthouse had been a performance space. This apartment was just a place to live, and there was something in that distinction she was still learning to appreciate. She had been there for 3 weeks when the Singapore trip happened. The flight was 14 hours with a connection in Tokyo, and she spent most of it working through the Pacific Rim freight file that Pauline had assembled. 20 years of contract history, Marcus Tan's communication record with Leonard, the specific terms of the Meridian rerouting that had quietly redirected $94 million worth of Singapore business through Damien's shell structure over 18 months. She read it all twice. The second time she made notes in the margins in the small, dense handwriting she'd had since college. The kind of writing you develop when you're trying to fit more thought onto the page than the page wants to hold. Pauline slept for 6 hours on the Tokyo leg, which Evelyn envied without resentment. She had tried and given up after 40 minutes, lying in the dark with the low hum of the aircraft all around her, thinking about the meeting ahead. Marcus Tan was 63 and had run Pacific Rim Freight for 22 years. He had known Leonard Whitmore since 1994, had flown to Chicago for Leonard's funeral, had sent Evelyn a handwritten condolence letter that she had kept, and which was currently in a box in the Lincoln Park apartment, with other things she couldn't part with and hadn't yet found the right place for. He was not a man who responded well to corporate theater. Leonard had told her that once, in a passing observation, she'd filed away without knowing she'd need it. Marcus doesn't want to be sold to. He wants to know who he's dealing with. Tell him the truth fast or don't bother going. She was going to tell him the truth fast. They landed in Singapore at 11 in the morning local time, and by 2 o'clock she and Pauline were sitting in a conference room on the 31st floor of the Pacific Rim Freight Building in the Central Business District, with the harbor visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and a tray of tea that neither of them had touched. Marcus Tan came in without preamble, the way Leonard had always come into rooms, as if the room had been waiting for him to start rather than the other way around. He was compact and precise in his movements, gray at the temples, with the particular alertness of someone who spent decades reading people across long conference tables and had gotten very good at it. He sat down and looked at Evelyn. "You look like your father," he said, "around the eyes." "People say that," she said. "It's accurate." He poured his own tea. "I spoke with Leonard 10 days before he died, you know. We had a call about the next contract cycle. He sounded fine, completely himself." He paused. "Then he was gone. These things don't make sense." "No," Evelyn agreed. "And then the man he brought into his company spent 2 years redirecting my contracts through a shell entity in the Cayman Islands." He said it flatly, without heat, the way you state a fact you've had time to process. "I'd like to understand how that happened." So she told him. Not the version she'd given the board, the operational, let's move forward version, the real version, how Damien had worked, how the grief had created an opening, how long it had taken her to see it clearly, and how much she had built in the 8 months before she acted. She told him about Gerald Holt's envelope, about Adrian's files, about Pauline in the coffee shop in Lincoln Park. She talked for almost 30 minutes, and Marcus listened without interrupting, which Pauline later told her was not something he typically did. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the harbor. "Leonard trusted you," he said finally. "He talked about you when we'd have dinner. He said you had better instincts than you gave yourself credit for. He said the problem was you'd been told for too long to defer to people who knew less than you did, and you'd started believing it." Evelyn looked at the table for a moment. He was right. "Yes." Marcus turned back to her. "What are you going to do with the company?" It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer, but the honest version of the answer was still partly information, and she said so. "I'm still building the picture. There are things my father was working on before he died, development plans I found in his desk files that hadn't been implemented. I want to understand those before I commit to a direction." "What kind of plans?" "Clean energy applications." He was interested in the intersection of logistics infrastructure and green transport. There are notes going back 4 years, studies he'd commissioned quietly, concept work. It wasn't public. She paused. "I think he didn't want Damien to know about it." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "Leonard was ahead of things," he said. "He always was. In 1994, everyone thought Trans-Pacific Freight was for manufacturers who couldn't find local supply chains. He saw it differently." A pause. "If you're going to develop the clean energy direction, you're going to need partners who understand the Asia-Pacific infrastructure. That conversation takes years to build from scratch." "I know." "You don't have to build it from scratch," he said. "You have a 20-year relationship sitting in this room." He picked up his tea finally. "Fix the contracts. Do it right. Be transparent about the recovery timeline on the Meridian accounts. And when you're ready to talk about what comes next, the development work, the new directions, come back to Singapore and we'll have dinner. It was not a formal commitment. It was the beginning of one, which was more valuable and harder to get. Thank you, Evelyn said. Don't thank me yet. His expression wasn't quite a smile, but it contained something that functioned like warmth. Come back ready to talk numbers. Leonard never wanted to be thanked before the work was done either. She almost laughed. That's accurate. They spent 2 more hours going through the specific contract recovery terms. Pauline handled the operational detail with the focused, unflappable competence that had made her irreplaceable for 11 years. And Evelyn watched her across the table and thought, she should have had this title 3 years ago. The fact that she didn't, that Damien had kept her in a role that was influential but not authoritative, valued but not elevated, was part of the same pattern. He had understood instinctively who the capable people were and had structured things so their capability served him rather than the company. That was over now. They flew back to Chicago with the preliminary contract framework agreed and a follow-up meeting scheduled for 6 weeks out. Evelyn slept for 7 hours on the return flight, which was the most consecutive sleep she'd gotten in a month, and woke up over the Pacific with the specific disorientation of not knowing immediately what time it was or where she was, just the dark window and the hum of the engines and the sensation of being suspended between things. She thought about her father's development files. She had found them 3 days after the board meeting, going through the locked drawer of Leonard's desk, her desk now, with a key she'd discovered in the back of a box of his personal effects that she'd been given after the funeral and had never fully sorted through. The drawer held 3 manila folders and a USB drive. The folders were filled with hand-annotated feasibility studies, printed articles with Leonard's marginalia in his distinctive cramped writing, correspondence with a clean energy consulting firm in Boston that she'd had to Google to identify. The USB contained spreadsheet models and design concept documents that Leonard had apparently commissioned and received in the final year of his life. She had sat at that desk for 2 hours reading through everything, and what she had found was a coherent vision, not fully formed, not ready to implement, but coherent in the way that things are when someone has been thinking about them seriously for a long time. Leonard had seen where the logistics industry was going 20 years before the industry would be forced to acknowledge it. He had been building the intellectual framework for Whitmore Global's next evolution quietly, privately, in the margins of a company he was also running at full tilt. He had never told Damien because he had known, on some level, that Damien would monetize it immediately, would take the concept and financialize it and extract value from it without building anything real. And real was what Leonard wanted. She had a lot to live up to. She was trying to be honest about that rather than either pretending it was manageable or letting it paralyze her. The federal case moved on its own timeline, which was slower than the courtroom drama had made it feel. Marcus Webb was doing what criminal defense attorneys do, building the architecture of reasonable doubt, filing motions, contesting evidence chains, working the procedural levers that exist for exactly this purpose. Damien had made bail at $250,000, secured by assets that the federal accounting was still working through to determine were actually his to pledge. He was living in an apartment in the Gold Coast that Evelyn understood was paid for by someone, or she didn't know who, and found she didn't particularly need to. She heard about him in fragments, the way you hear about people who have exited your life violently rather than gradually. Torres mentioned him in the context of case updates. Margaret filtered the legal communications. Once she saw him mentioned in a Tribune follow-up piece, a photograph taken outside the federal building, Damien in a dark coat looking at the pavement, Marcus Webb beside him with the practiced affect of a man who is never photographed reacting to anything. He looked, she thought, like a man who was discovering something about himself that he hadn't known was there. A limit, a bottom, the place where the resources run out and what's underneath is just the person. She didn't know what he was finding under there. She had thought she knew him and she had been wrong about important things, so she had learned to be cautious about that kind of inference. She had not responded to Celeste Monroe's text. She had reread it twice in the weeks after and had not been able to determine what the right response was, and had decided that no response was a response of its own kind and let it go. It was Adrian, 6 weeks after the Singapore trip, who first raised the question of what Evelyn was going to do with her father's development files. He had come to the office for what was supposed to be a routine check-in on the cybersecurity infrastructure rebuild. Damien's tenure had left several gaps in the system's integrity that needed addressing, and had found Evelyn at her desk with the manila folders spread out and a legal pad covered in notes. He looked at the spread from the doorway. "What's that?" "Come in," she said. "Close the door." He came in and closed the door and stood at the edge of the desk looking at the papers. He picked up one of the annotated feasibility studies, a document about electric-powered freight vessel technology that Leonard had marked up extensively in red pen, and read the first page. "Where did you find this?" "Locked drawer." He left a key in his personal effects box. Adrian read for another 30 seconds, then set it down. "He was building something." "Yes." "And Cross never knew." "Apparently not." Adrian pulled a chair from the corner and sat down. He had the look he got when he was thinking through something structural, a kind of internal focusing, like a lens adjusting. "These vessel specs are real. This isn't just concept work." He had someone run actual feasibility modeling. "The Boston firm, Meridian Clean Transport." She paused at the name, not the Cayman shell, a different Meridian, another one of those coincidences that felt loaded, but probably wasn't. "I've been in contact with them. The principal consultant, a woman named Dr. Reyes, worked with Leonard for about a year before he died. She said he was serious. She said he had the right instincts but wanted to move carefully because the capital requirements were significant, and he didn't want to expose the company before the model was proven." "How far is the model from being proven?" 3 to 5 years of development work, maybe faster with the right infrastructure partnerships. She looked at him. "Marcus Tan mentioned the Asia-Pacific infrastructure when I was in Singapore. The harbor facilities, the Pacific freight routes. If you're building electric freight vessels, you need ports that can service them. Singapore has been investing in that infrastructure already." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "This is a major pivot." "Yes." "The board is going to have opinions. The board is going to have lots of opinions. I'm going to listen to them and then make the decisions I think are correct. And I'm going to be transparent about what I know and what I don't know, and we're going to see what happens." She paused. "My father built a 30-year company from a one-room office near the port. I'm not going to pretend I know how to do that, but I know more than I'm being given credit for, and I know who to ask when I don't know something, and that's more than Damien ever brought to this desk." Adrian looked at her for a moment. "He never asked anyone anything," he said. "Not really. He listened to people when they confirmed what he already wanted to hear and ignored them when they didn't. It made him feel like he was decisive. What it actually made him was blind." "I know. You're not doing that." "I'm trying not to." "There's a difference between trying not to and actually not doing it." "I know that too," she said. "Hence the trying." He almost smiled. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to look at the technical infrastructure requirements in the clean energy model and tell me honestly whether the cybersecurity and data architecture we have can support a major development program. Not now. We're not there yet. But in the next 6 months before we start talking to outside investors, I need to know what the system looks like and what it needs." "I can do that. And I need it to be honest, not what you think I want to hear." "Evelyn?" He looked at her with the flat directness he'd always had, the reason Leonard had trusted him, and the reason Damien had removed him. "When have I ever told you what you want to hear?" She thought about it. "Never," she said. "Right, so stop asking me to be honest. I'm always honest. Just give me 3 weeks and the full file set." She handed him the USB drive. He looked at it, turned it over in his hand, and put it in his jacket pocket. "One more thing," he said, standing. "What?" He hesitated, which was not something Adrian typically did. "How are you?" "Actually." She looked at him. It was the kind of question that deserved a real answer, and she had been giving insufficient ones for 6 weeks, including to Margaret and Pauline and her mother, all of whom had asked versions of it and received versions of "I'm fine, let's keep working." "Some days are better than others," she said. "I'm sleeping more than I was in October. I've started drawing again. I used to draw before. I cook actual food in the Lincoln Park apartment, which sounds small, but it matters somehow." She paused. "I'm not over it. I don't think over it is the right frame. Something happened to me for 3 years and now it's over, and I'm living in the space that's left, which is not comfortable yet, but it's real." She looked at the desk, at the photograph on the credenza. That's the best I've got right now. Adrian nodded. That's more than most people would have right now. Maybe. He left, and she turned back to the files. The board meeting in December was the 5th since the October divorce hearing, and by now they had found a working rhythm. Not comfortable, not frictionless, but functional in the way that a group of people can become functional when the alternative is collapse, and they are all, on some level, motivated to avoid it. Richard Chen had clarified his position quietly and practically, as she had expected. He had voted against 2 of Damien's proposals in the final 6 months before the fraud came to light. Votes that, when she reviewed the board minutes, looked like the actions of a man who had started to suspect something and was hedging, and had made sure Evelyn was aware of those votes without explicitly pointing to them as exculpatory. She had noted it and moved on. He was useful and she was going to keep him, and they both understood that was conditional on continued usefulness. Warren Fitch had resigned from the board in November. His resignation letter was 3 paragraphs of circumspect language that said nothing specifically but communicated everything. She had accepted it without comment and appointed James Okafor as interim board chair while the governance structure was rebuilt, which Okafor had accepted with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been waiting a long time to be useful in the way he was actually capable of being useful. The December meeting was when she first presented the Clean Energy Initiative to the board, not as a proposal, not yet, as a briefing. This is what Leonard was building. This is what I found. This is the shape of the question I'm going to be spending the next year answering. The room was quiet while she talked. She had spent 2 weeks preparing the presentation and 3 days deciding how to present it, how much to reveal, how much to hold back until she was sure, how to frame it in a way that acknowledged the uncertainty without making the board think they were betting on vapor. She showed them the feasibility models. She summarized Dr. Reyes's assessment. She outlined the Asia-Pacific infrastructure context and what Marcus Tan had indicated about partnership potential. She talked about the capital requirements honestly, including the ranges she didn't know yet, and the timelines that were estimates rather than projections. When she finished, Okafor said, "Leonard showed me some of this, 2 years before he died. He mentioned he was working on something, but he wasn't ready to bring it to the board yet." Evelyn looked at him. "He told you?" "In general terms. Over dinner." Okafor paused. "He said the logistics industry was going to be forced into a transformation it wasn't ready for, and he'd rather be the one doing the forcing than the one being forced. He looked at the presentation materials. He would have done this if he'd had time." "I know," Evelyn said. "Then do it," Okafor said. "Build the proof of concept. Get the right partners. Come back to the board when you've got something you can actually defend." He looked around the table. "Objections?" There were questions, good ones, about capital exposure and timeline risk, and what happened to the core logistics business during a development period. She answered what she could and said clearly what she didn't know yet, and the meeting ended without a formal vote because she hadn't asked for one. She had asked for understanding, which was different, and she had gotten most of it. Walking back to her office afterward, Pauline fell into step beside her. "Chen is going to be a problem on the capital question," Pauline said. "I know. He's going to want external validation before he'll support the development funding. Then we'll get external validation. Dr. Reyes knows 2 academics at Kellogg who've published on green logistics transformation. We'll commission an independent assessment." Pauline looked at her sideways. "You already thought of that." "I thought of it last week." "You could have said so in the meeting." "I wanted to hear what Chen was going to do first," Evelyn said. "If he'd been a different kind of problem, the solution would have been different." Pauline was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father used to do that. Wait for people to show you what kind of problem they were before deciding how to solve them." Evelyn didn't say anything. She had been hearing that more lately. "This thing you did, Leonard used to do it." She didn't know entirely how to receive it. She wasn't her father. She was doing it differently, in the way that someone does a thing differently when they've learned it through absence rather than presence, through the shape of the gap rather than the direct instruction. But she was doing it. The trial date was set in January for the following September, which meant the federal case was going to be a low-grade presence in her life for the better part of a year, something she couldn't fully put down but also couldn't focus on without letting it consume the attention she needed for the work. Torres had told her in their formal interview, which had lasted 4 hours and covered the full timeline in exhaustive detail, that the case was strong. The Meridian documentation was clean. Adrian's records were meticulous. The courtroom footage was, Torres said in a moment of professional understatement, extremely useful. Evelyn had asked, toward the end of the interview, about the cartel money laundering charge, the one that had surprised her when she first saw the indictment, more serious in its implications than the corporate fraud charges. Torres had been careful. The Meridian accounts were used as a channel. We believe Damien was aware. The specifics are still under investigation, and I can't give you more than that. She paused. Did you ever have any indication? No, Evelyn said. And then, because honesty mattered more than protecting herself from the discomfort of the question, but I might not have recognized it if I had. I didn't know what I was looking at for a long time. That's very common, Torres said. People who operate these schemes understand that. They depend on it. It was a kind framing. Evelyn appreciated it without entirely accepting it. There were things she had chosen not to see, and the choosing hadn't been fully conscious, but it had been real, and she carried that. February arrived with the particular severity of a Chicago February. Wind off the lake that had real teeth, temperatures that made leaving any warm space feel like a minor act of violence against yourself. Evelyn had bought a better coat, which felt like a small victory and probably wasn't, but she counted it anyway. She was at her desk at 7:30 on a Thursday morning when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Evelyn? The voice was Damien's. She sat very still. I know you don't want to hear from me, he said. I know I have no standing to call you. A pause. His voice had something in it that she hadn't heard before, or perhaps had heard and not recognized for what it was, because before it had always been wrapped in the performance. Stripped of the performance, it was just tiredness. I needed to say that I'm sorry. I know it doesn't do anything. I know sorry doesn't work at this scale. I'm not calling because I think it changes anything. She waited. I keep thinking about what I said in that office, he continued, on the recording, about you not being able to read a balance sheet. A silence. That was the most dishonest thing I ever said. I knew exactly how capable you were. I just needed you not to know it. She had thought over the months about what she would say to him if she ever had the chance to say anything directly. She had run through versions of it at 2 in the morning in the Lincoln Park apartment with the radiator knocking. She had imagined the sharp, precise statements that would let him know exactly what he had cost her. What she said instead was, Why are you calling me, Damien? A long pause. Because Webb told me not to and I did it anyway, which is apparently something I do. She almost said something to that. She stopped herself. You need to hang up and call Marcus Webb, she said, and I need you to not contact me again. A beat. Okay. Okay, she said. She ended the call and set the phone on the desk and sat for a moment looking at the lake through the east window. The water was dark and choppy and the February wind, steel gray and cold. Nothing romantic about it. Just the physical fact of a very large amount of water doing what water does. She picked up her phone and called Torres. Damien Cross called me this morning. I'm informing you immediately. She gave Torres the time and the duration and the substance of the call in 3 sentences. Thank you, Torres said. We'll note it. Do you feel he's a threat in any way? No, Evelyn said. I think he's just someone who's finally facing what he is, and he needed to say one true thing to someone who knew him. She paused. That doesn't make it okay for him to call, but that's what it was. She hung up, looked at the lake for another moment, then opened her laptop and went back to work. There were contract documents to review, a call with Dr. Reyes at 10, a lunch with Okafor that she'd been rescheduling for 2 weeks. Adrian had sent his infrastructure assessment at midnight. She'd found it in her inbox at 6:15 and had been saving it for when she had an hour of unbroken attention to give it. The company was not fixed. It was a long way from fixed. The development initiative was real but preliminary. The legal process was ongoing. The board was still finding its shape around her authority. The Singapore relationship was recovering in the slow way that trust recovers, through repeated small demonstrations rather than any single gesture. None of it was finished. All of it was real. She opened Adrian's report and started reading. His first line was characteristically direct. The system has 6 significant vulnerabilities that Damien's tenure created or allowed to develop. I've documented all of them. The good news? None are fatal. The better news? Fixing them properly will make this infrastructure stronger than it was before he touched it. Here's where we start. She read to the end of the first section, made 3 margin notes, and flagged 2 questions to send back to him. Outside, the lake kept moving. The city kept going. The radiator in her Lincoln Park apartment was probably knocking right now in the empty room, on schedule, indifferent to whether anyone was there to hear it. She turned to the second section of Adrian's report and kept reading. Adrian's infrastructure report took Evelyn 11 days to fully absorb, not because it was impenetrable, but because she kept stopping to follow the implications of what he'd written into corners she hadn't considered yet. He had a way of documenting problems that made you see not just the problem, but the decision that had allowed it. The specific moment someone had chosen convenience over integrity, or speed over rigor, and what that choice had quietly permitted downstream. She read it the way her father had taught her to read contracts, not for what they said, but for what they assumed. By the time she finished, she had 14 pages of notes and a clearer picture of what the company actually was beneath the 3 years of Damien's management, which was, in the main, a sound structure that had been hollowed out in specific and identifiable ways, most of which were fixable if you were willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of fixing them, rather than papering over them and moving on. She was willing to do the slow work. She had learned, in the past several months, that slow work was the only kind that actually held. She scheduled a full-day session with Adrian in mid-February, and they went through the report section by section at the long conference table with coffee and a whiteboard and no one else in the room. It was the kind of working session she hadn't had since before her father died. The kind where you're actually thinking rather than performing thinking, where you can say, I don't understand this, without it meaning anything about your authority, where the goal is to get to the right answer rather than to look like you already have it. This note here, she said at one point, pointing to a diagram he'd drawn on the whiteboard, an architecture of the company's data systems with the vulnerabilities marked in red. Damien approved this configuration in 2022? He did, Adrian said. I think he was told it was more efficient, and he didn't ask what it was efficient at the expense of. The answer was security. Who told him it was more efficient? The contractor he brought in after he pushed me out. Adrian paused. The contractor also happened to be recommended by one of the Meridian-connected entities. Torres's team is looking at that separately. She stared at the diagram. The thing about fraud at a certain scale was how structural it became. Not a single act of dishonesty, but a whole architecture of small compromises that accumulated into something that looked, from the inside, almost normal. You had to get far enough outside it to see the shape. Fix this node first, she said, before anything else. Already started, Adrian said. I've been phasing in corrections for 3 weeks. Didn't want to wait for the meeting. She looked at him. You started before I asked? I started before I wrote the report, he said. The vulnerabilities were real. Waiting felt irresponsible. She thought about that for a moment. This was what Leonard had known about Adrian that Damien had never understood. That he wasn't a vendor, wasn't a service provider in the transactional sense. He was someone who cared about the thing itself, about the system's integrity for its own sake, and that quality was worth more than any efficiency gain Damien's replacement contractor had ever delivered. Put your rate on a proper contract, she said, not the consulting arrangement. A real contract with real terms. You've been freelancing this for 6 months. I wasn't worried about the money. I know you weren't. I am. She picked up her coffee. You should be compensated properly for what you're doing. That's not negotiable. He looked at her for a moment with the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who is not accustomed to being valued in concrete terms and isn't sure how to respond to it. Okay, he said finally. Good. Now show me the 4th section, the offshore data question. They worked until 6 in the evening, and when they finished, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in a long time in a work context. The specific satisfaction of having genuinely understood something difficult. Not performed understanding. Not nodded through a briefing she was going to have to quietly research afterward. Actually understood. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. March came in cold and then softened by the 3rd week into something that wasn't quite spring, but was willing to pretend. The trees along the Lincoln Park running path had the first haze of green on them that always appeared before you were sure it was real, and Evelyn had started running again in the mornings. Not competitively, not with any particular goal, just moving through the cool air before the day started, which was something she had done in her 20s and had stopped somewhere in the early years of the marriage, when the mornings had become Damien's logistical theater. She was not a graceful runner. She was a functional one. She ran at a pace that was embarrassing if you cared about pace and adequate if you cared about the running, and she had decided she cared about the running. Her mother called her on a Tuesday morning while she was stretching on the path afterward, slightly out of breath, sitting on a bench with the lake visible through the trees. "The Tribune ran another piece," Ruth said, "about the trial. September." "I know. Are you going to have to testify?" "Probably." Margaret is working through the parameters. She watched a pair of geese cross the path about 30 yards away with the magnificent indifference of city geese everywhere. "It's going to be fine, Mom." "You keep saying that, and I keep being right." A pause. Her mother made a sound that was not quite agreement but acknowledged the point. "I want to come to the office," she said. "I've been thinking about it. I want to see what you've done with it." Evelyn stopped stretching. "With what?" "The company. Leonard's office. All of it." A pause, and in it something careful and real. "I've been staying away because I didn't know if I was ready. I think I am now. I want to see what it looks like with you in it." The thing her mother wasn't saying, but that Evelyn heard anyway, was, "I want to see that it's going to be all right, not the company. You." "Come Thursday," Evelyn said. "I'll take you to lunch at the place he used to take us. The Italian place on Wabash. He always ordered the same thing. The ossobuco every time, even in July." Her mother laughed. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind Evelyn hadn't heard from her in a while. "He said it was the only thing on the menu that took long enough to make to be worth ordering," which was a completely insane food philosophy. It was absolutely insane, her mother agreed. He was right about the ossobuco, though. "He was right about most things," Evelyn said. "Not everything, but most things." Another pause, warmer this time. "Thursday," her mother said. "I'll take the train." September arrived the way Chicago Septembers do, with a brief, golden reprieve before the lake started reasserting itself. The trial had been moved twice since January, once because of a scheduling conflict in the federal court calendar, once because Marcus Webb had successfully argued for additional discovery time. Torres had kept Evelyn updated at each shift without editorializing, and Evelyn had absorbed the delays with the patience of someone who had learned over the past year that some things move on their own timeline regardless of what you need from them. The trial began on a Tuesday. Evelyn did not attend the opening arguments. She watched the press coverage from her office in the way you watch something that concerns you, but that you have no power over, with the particular distance of a person who has done their part and handed the rest to institutions designed to handle it. Damien's defense was what Webb had apparently telegraphed it would be. The claim that he had been operating under a legitimate mandate to restructure the company during a period of leadership transition, that the Meridian accounts had been established with the knowledge of other executives, and that the footage in Evelyn's courtroom had been taken out of context. The cartel money laundering charge was contested most vigorously, Webb arguing that his client had been unknowingly used as a conduit by parties he had trusted. It wasn't an implausible defense in the abstract. It fell apart against Adrian's documentation, which was, as Torres had said many months ago, extraordinarily thorough. The Meridian ownership trail was unambiguous. The wire transfer records were dated and specific. The communications between Damien and the Cayman-registered entities were detailed in ways that made unknowing conduit very difficult to sustain. Evelyn testified on a Thursday in the third week of trial. She had prepared with Margaret for 3 sessions and had come to understand through those sessions what she was actually being asked to do. Not to perform her victimhood, not to perform her recovery, but to give the court an accurate account of what she had observed and experienced and known and not known. Margaret kept telling her, just tell what happened, in the order it happened. When you didn't know something, say you didn't know. When you should have known sooner, don't hide from it. She testified for 4 hours. Webb's cross-examination lasted 90 minutes, and he was skilled. He found the places where her account was uncertain or where her timeline had gaps, and he pressed on them with professional precision. She answered what she could answer and said clearly what she couldn't, and she did not let him rattle her into saying things that weren't accurate. When he asked her whether she had ever directly witnessed Damien instruct anyone to move funds into the Meridian accounts, she said no, because she hadn't, and when he tried to build from that no toward a larger implication, she said, "I didn't witness it directly. What I witnessed was the result. The documentation Mr. Thorne assembled shows the mechanism." The judge sustained Torres's objection before Webb could follow up. Walking out of the federal building afterward, Margaret beside her, the September air sharp and clean after the climate-controlled courtroom, Evelyn felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully known was still there. The last held breath of the legal process, the final waiting. Her part was done. Whatever came next was in the hands of 12 people who had sat and listened and were going to go decide. "You were good in there," Margaret said. "I was honest in there," Evelyn said. "That's different." In that room, they're the same thing. They walked to Margaret's car. The city was doing what it always did. Indifferent, full, continuous. A food truck on the corner was selling tacos to a line of people who were thinking about lunch and nothing else. Two teenagers in school uniforms were arguing about something on the sidewalk, with the total conviction of people for whom the argument was the most important thing currently happening in the world. Evelyn thought, this is what normal feels like. Not happiness, not triumph, just the ordinary human experience of being in the middle of things and having a part to play in playing it, and then walking out into the air. She had forgotten what that felt like. She was remembering. The verdict came back in October. Damien Cross was found guilty on 7 of 9 counts: wire fraud, corporate fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 3 counts related to the money laundering scheme. The 2 counts the jury acquitted on were peripheral, related to specific transactions that Webb had successfully argued were ambiguous in their intent. Torres called Evelyn before the press got to it. 7 counts, she said. Sentencing is scheduled for January. Evelyn was standing at the east window when the call came in. The lake was doing what the lake always did in October, gray and enormous and indifferent to the small human drama playing out on its shore. "Thank you," she said. "Thank your father's trust attorney. And Adrian Thorne." A pause. "And yourself. You built the case by staying in that marriage long enough to gather what you needed and getting out the moment you had enough to act. That's harder than it sounds." She didn't say anything to that. It was true, and it was also a reductive way to describe what the past 2 years had cost her, and Torres knew both of those things, which was why she'd said it and then stopped. "What happens at sentencing?" Evelyn asked. "Federal guidelines put him at 8 to 12 years on the counts as charged. Webb will argue for the lower end. Prosecution will argue for the higher end. Judge will decide somewhere in between." A pause. "He'll do time. How much time is the January question?" She ended the call and stood at the window for a long time. She had expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Some version of closure, maybe, or the dramatic exhale of something finally finished. What she felt instead was quieter and more complicated, a kind of solemn recognition that the mechanism had worked, that the institutions had done what institutions are supposed to do when someone brings them the right information in the right form, and that this was not triumphing over Damien, but simply the correct end of a process that had needed to happen. He was going to prison. She was going to keep running the company. Those were the facts. The rest? The years of marriage, the specific shape of what he had stolen from her, the late nights and the dinner table performances, and the morning she had sat in a Chicago courtroom and watched the floor disappear under him, none of that resolved neatly into a verdict. It just was. It was part of what had happened, and what had happened was part of who she was, and she was going to carry it without being defined by it, which was the best she could do and probably enough. She picked up her phone and called her mother. The sentencing in January gave Damien 9 years. He would be eligible for parole consideration after serving 6, which meant he would be in his mid-50s when he first had the possibility of leaving, and older than that in probability. Marcus Webb had delivered a competent argument for leniency. The prosecution had delivered a thorough argument against it. The judge had listened to both and landed where he landed. Evelyn did not go to the sentencing. She had considered it and decided that her presence would be about something other than the proceeding itself, about witnessing or about being seen to witness, and that neither of those things was what she actually needed. She read the coverage that evening in the Lincoln Park apartment, the radiator knocking at its usual time, a glass of wine on the table that she kept forgetting to drink. She thought about Damien in a way she hadn't allowed herself to in a long time. Not as the antagonist of her own story, but as a person, a specific flawed person who had looked at a grieving woman and seen an opportunity and had taken it, and who was now going to spend a significant portion of his remaining middle years inside a federal facility thinking about what that decision had cost. She did not feel sorry for him. She did not feel satisfied either. She felt something closer to the recognition that human beings are capable of tremendous damage when they believe that the world owes them more than it's giving, and that the belief itself, the entitlement, the conviction that someone else's inheritance was really theirs to take, was the real disease. The fraud had been the symptom. She didn't know if that insight helped anyone. It might not, but it was what she had, and she held it. The Clean Energy Initiative was formally announced to the market in March, 14 months after Evelyn had first spread her father's development files across that desk and called Adrian to look at them with her. It was called the Whitmore Forward Program, which was not the name she had originally proposed. She had wanted something more technical, and Pauline had told her that technical names didn't travel, that what you needed was a name that told people what direction you were facing. She'd been right. Evelyn had changed it. The announcement was not a press conference in the traditional sense. No podium, no prepared statement read into a camera. She had decided against that, had decided that the announcement should be a presentation to the company's employees first and the market second, because the people who had stayed through the worst of the past 2 years were the ones who deserved to know first what was coming next. She stood in the main conference space on the 28th floor. They'd opened up the movable partitions to create one large room, and it was full, people standing along the walls, the overflow watching on a live stream on the floor below. And she looked at the room and started talking. She told them about her father's files, about the locked drawer and the key in the box, about the 4 years of quiet research he'd done, the Boston consulting firm, the annotated feasibility studies she had spent months working through with people who actually understood the technical landscape. She told them what she had found and what she thought it meant and where she thought it could go and how long she thought it would honestly take and what she didn't know yet, which was still a significant amount. She did not perform confidence she didn't have. She said, "This is a 10-year project minimum. I believe in it. The models support it. Our Asia-Pacific partnerships are aligned with it. But it is genuinely uncertain in the ways that real things are uncertain, and I'm not going to tell you otherwise." She said, "The core business is not being abandoned. The logistics operations that Leonard built and that this company runs are what fund everything else we're talking about, and they deserve the same serious attention they've always received, and under Pauline's operational leadership, they are going to get it." She said, "Some of you have been here through things I wouldn't have wished on anyone. And I know that the past 2 years have made it hard to know what this company stands for. I want you to know that from where I'm standing, it stands for what Leonard Whitmore always said it stood for moving things from where they are to where they need to be, and for doing it with enough integrity that people trust you to do it again. That's what we're building. That's what the Forward program is about. The freight, the clean transport, all of it. It's the same idea, just aimed further out." When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable silence of a thing that has landed badly, but the kind that follows something that requires a beat before anyone can figure out how to respond to it. Then Pauline started clapping, not as a signal for others to follow. She started clapping because she meant it, and the room followed because they meant it too. Evelyn stood there for a moment in the noise of it and didn't know what to do with her hands, which felt appropriately human. She went to the 32nd floor after the announcement. The rest of the day was meetings, press, investors, internal follow-up. But she had built 30 minutes into the schedule for this, and she was going to use them. She sat behind the desk in the quiet of the office and looked at the east-facing window and the water beyond it. The March lake was still winter gray, still enormous, still moving in the low, determined way it moved when the weather hadn't quite decided to shift yet. She thought about her father. Not the version of him that had appeared in the past year and a half as a resource, the trust clause, the development files, the network of loyal people he'd left behind, but the actual person. Leonard Whitmore, who had grown up 3 blocks from this lake and built something on its shore that was supposed to outlast him, and who had suspected it might be threatened and had taken what steps he could, and then died before he could know whether they'd worked. They'd worked. That was the thing she wanted him to know. The steps he'd taken, the sealed envelope, the people he'd chosen and trusted, they had worked. Not cleanly, not without cost, not without years of difficulty she hadn't entirely put down yet, but they had worked. She was sitting in his office, she was running his company, she was taking it in the direction he had been quietly building toward and had run out of time to reach. Those were the facts. She picked up the 1987 photograph from the credenza. Her father at the docks with his first real contract, younger than she was now, surrounded by people who'd helped him get there. He was looking at the camera with the expression of a man who has just accomplished something significant and hasn't yet started worrying about the next thing. There was an uncomplicated joy in it that was rare in photographs of him. He'd been, in most of her memory, a man in motion, always already looking toward the next problem. But in this one, he was just standing there, happy, present. She had his eyes, people kept telling her, around the eyes. She set the photograph back on the credenza and sat for a moment with the lake and the gray light and the quiet. She was not the woman who had sat in a hotel room at 4:30 in the morning looking at a box of documents. She was not entirely someone new either. She was in between, in the middle of becoming something she couldn't fully see the shape of yet, which was uncomfortable and necessary, and when she was honest with herself, more interesting than she would have expected. She had learned things she hadn't wanted to have to learn, about how people justify taking what isn't theirs, about how easy it is to stop trusting your own judgment when enough pressure is applied for long enough, about the specific, invisible labor of rebuilding confidence that someone else has systematically dismantled, how slow it is, how the progress is measured in small decisions rather than dramatic turning points, how there is no single morning when you wake up and you're back to yourself, just a long accumulation of mornings that gradually produce a person you can recognize. She had learned that loyalty is a real thing, that people like Pauline and Adrian and Okafor and Gerald Holt exist. People who hold their positions and wait because the thing they're protecting matters to them beyond what they get from protecting it. The world had more of those people in it than she had believed. In the years when Damien was the loudest voice in the room, she had learned that her father's way of doing things, the patience, the long view, the refusal to extract value without building something real, was not sentimental. It was strategic in the deepest sense. It produced loyalty and partnerships and trust that persisted across decades, and that no fraud, however sophisticated, could fully erase. Damien had spent 3 years trying to hollow out something Leonard spent 30 years building, and the thing was still standing. That was the lesson. Not that virtue triumphs. The world is too complicated and too indifferent for that to be reliably true. But that what you build with genuine care is harder to destroy than what you build for extraction. The difference matters. It shows up in the people who stay, in the partners who pick up the phone, in the attorneys who hold envelopes for 3 years without breaking. She was going to build something genuine. She was not going to be her father. She was going to be herself, which meant different mistakes, different blindnesses, different strengths she hadn't identified yet. She was going to get things wrong and fix them, and get other things wrong and fix those too. She was going to take the company in a direction that was uncertain and necessary, and that Leonard had pointed toward from a desk he no longer sat at, and she was going to do it imperfectly, because imperfectly was how real things got done. The 30 minutes were almost up. She stood, straightened her jacket, picked up her portfolio. 3 meetings before 5. Dr. Reyes was flying in from Boston next week. Marcus Tan had confirmed the June Singapore follow-up. The board had approved the initial development funding by a vote of 5-2, which was not unanimous and was not going to be the last contested vote, and was exactly the kind of narrow, real progress that actually moved things. She walked to the door of the office and stopped. She looked back at the room once, the desk where her father had worked for 30 years, the credenza with the 1987 photograph, the east-facing window that had been chosen for the morning light. She was going to keep the office exactly as it was, not as a memorial, as a working space, Because the morning light was genuinely good, and the desk was solid, and the view of the lake was a reminder of something she needed to remember. The water doesn't stop. The water doesn't apologize. She turned and walked down the hall toward the elevator, toward the rest of the day, toward the long, unfinished, necessary work of building something worth protecting. Behind her, through the east-facing window, the lake kept moving. It always did.